The morning sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold as Valeth crouched behind the broken wall of what was once a temple. Her silver hair was tied back tight, and her green eyes watched the distant palace with the patience of a predator. She had waited 300 years for this moment. The tyrant Morvak had ruled for too long, and today his reign would end with a single arrow. But Valeth was not like other elves. She had spent 50 years living among humans in the outer settlements. The other elves called her tainted for this choice. They said she had lost her purity by walking with the short-lived races. But Valeth knew the truth. The humans had taught her something that no elf had ever understood. They had taught her how to feel urgency. They had taught her how to fight like there was no tomorrow, because for them, there often was no tomorrow. The palace of Morvak stood tall in the center of the broken city. Once this place had been beautiful. Gardens had bloomed in every corner. Children had laughed in the streets. But that was before Morvak came with his army of shadows and his magic that fed on suffering. Now the streets were empty. The gardens were dead. The people who remained lived in fear, hiding in cellars and abandoned buildings, praying that the shadow soldiers would not find them. Valeth pulled her bow from her back. It was not an elven bow. This surprised many people when they saw it. Elven bows were famous throughout the realm for their beauty and precision. They were carved from ancient trees and blessed by forest spirits. But Valeth carried a human bow. It was simple, made of yew wood and sinew. A human craftsman named Jorek had made it for her 40 years ago. He was dead now, taken by age like all humans eventually were. But his bow remained, and in Valeth's hands, it was the most dangerous weapon in the world. She remembered what Jorek had told her when he gave her the bow. He had said that elven bows were made for perfection, but human bows were made for survival. An elven bow expected its archer to be perfect every time. A human bow expected its archer to be desperate, to be fighting against all odds, to be making the impossible shot because there was no other choice. Valeth had not understood this at first, but over the years, she had come to see the wisdom in his words. The palace balcony was over 2,000 meters away. No elven archer had ever made such a shot. The wind was unpredictable, coming from the mountains in sudden gusts. The angle was steep, requiring the arrow to travel upward before falling down toward the target. Any other archer would have said it was impossible. But Valeth was not any other archer. She had one arrow, just one. She had crafted it herself over the course of 10 years. The shaft was made from the branch of a tree that had grown in the human settlement where she had lived. The feathers came from a bird that had died protecting its nest from a predator. The arrowhead was forged from metal that had once been a human soldier's sword, a soldier who had died fighting Morvak's army to give his family time to escape. Every part of this arrow carried the spirit of sacrifice and courage. Morvak appeared on the balcony exactly when Valeth expected him to appear. He was a tall creature, though calling him a man seemed wrong. He had started as an elf, thousands of years ago, but his hunger for power had twisted him into something else entirely. His skin was gray like ash. His eyes glowed with purple fire. He wore robes made from the shadows of his victims, and they moved around him like living things, whispering secrets and screaming silently. The tyrant raised his hands to address the empty city below. He did this every morning, speaking words of power that reinforced his control over the land. His magic spread from the palace like a disease, infecting everything it touched. As long as he lived, the suffering would continue. As long as he breathed, hope would die. Valeth stood slowly. She felt the wind on her face and let it tell her its secrets. Humans had taught her this too. Elves read the wind with magic, sensing its patterns through ancient spells. But the humans had shown her how to read it with her body, with the tiny hairs on her skin, with the way it pushed against her chest. This was more reliable than magic because magic could be fooled. The body never lied. She drew the bowstring back to her cheek. The yew wood bent under her strength, storing power like a coiled spring. Veileth's arms were steady, but her heart was racing. She allowed herself to feel the fear because the humans had taught her that fear was not weakness. Fear was energy. Fear was the body preparing itself for something important. The elves tried to eliminate fear through meditation and control. The humans embraced it and turned it into fuel. 2,000 meters. The wind shifted again, coming now from the east instead of the north. Veileth adjusted her aim by a fraction that would have been invisible to anyone watching. She breathed in slowly, filling her lungs with the morning air. She could smell the decay of the city, the corruption of Morvac's magic, and underneath it all, the faint scent of flowers that refused to die completely. Morvac's voice echoed across the city. He was speaking about eternal rule, about how resistance was meaningless, about how the people should accept their fate and serve him willingly. His words carried magic that pressed down on the soul like a weight. Veileth felt it trying to enter her mind, trying to make her believe that her mission was pointless, but she pushed it away. She had built walls inside herself, walls made from memories of human courage, from stories of people who had fought against impossible odds, not because they expected to win, but because fighting was the only choice that meant anything. She thought of Mira, a human girl she had known in the settlement. Mira had been sick with a disease that had no cure. The healers had given her weeks to live. But Myra had lived for 3 more years, fighting every single day, refusing to surrender to the darkness that was consuming her body. When she finally died, she did so with a smile, telling Veileth that she had won because she had chosen how to live her final days. That memory burned in Veileth's heart like a flame that could not be extinguished. She thought of Thomas, a human blacksmith who had lost his family to Morvac's soldiers. He could have run away. He could have hidden in the forests and lived out his remaining years in safety. Instead, he had started a resistance movement, training farmers and shopkeepers to fight with whatever weapons they could find. He had known he would probably die, and he had fought anyway. The elves called this stupidity. Veileth called it the most beautiful kind of bravery. The arrow knew where it needed to go. Veileth did not aim with her eyes or her mind. She aimed with her soul, with everything she had learned from the humans, with every sacrifice she had witnessed, with every story of courage that had been shared with her around campfires and in dying breaths. The bow was an extension of her arm. The arrow was an extension of her will. She released. The arrow flew from the bow with a sound like a whispered prayer. It climbed into the sky, catching the wind and riding it like a ship rides a wave. Veileth watched it go, her heart suspended between hope and despair. There was nothing more she could do now. The arrow would find its target, or it would not. The tyrant would fall, or he would not. Morvac sensed danger at the last moment. His magical awareness detected the approaching threat, and his head began to turn toward the distant temple where Veileth stood. But he was too slow. The arrow arrived before his eyes could find its source. It struck him in the chest, punching through the shadow robes and the magical barriers that protected him. For a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the arrowhead, forged from a hero's sword, began to burn with a light that had no source. The wood of the shaft, grown in a place where humans had built their homes and raised their children, released the energy of 1,000 ordinary lives lived with extraordinary courage. The feathers, taken from a bird that had died protecting what it loved, guided that energy straight into Morvac's corrupted heart. The tyrant screamed. It was a sound that shook the palace walls and cracked the stones of the courtyard below. Purple fire poured from his eyes and mouth as his magic tried desperately to heal the wound. But this arrow had been made for this moment. This arrow carried the essence of humanity, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, the fierce love that burned brighter than any magical flame. Morvac stumbled backward. His hands clawed at the arrow, but he could not touch it. The light was spreading now, consuming the shadows that made up his robes, breaking the chains of magic that bound the city. In windows and cellars throughout the land, people felt the weight lifting from their souls. They looked up with wide eyes, hardly daring to believe what they were feeling. The tyrant fell from his balcony. He did not fall like a creature of power. He fell like any mortal being falls, pulled down by gravity, spinning through the air, unable to stop himself. The ground received him without ceremony, and when he struck it, the light from the arrow exploded outward in a wave that raced across the city and beyond. Vaelith lowered her bow. Her arms were trembling now that the tension had been released. She watched the light spread across the dead gardens, and wherever it touched, something remarkable began to happen. Colors returned to the world. The gray stones of the buildings became warm again. The twisted trees began to straighten. And in the distance, she could hear something that had been absent from this city for a very long time. She could hear people cheering. They poured from their hiding places, thousands of them, looking up at the sky as if seeing the sun for the first time. Children clung to their parents. Old people wept with joy. Soldiers who had served Morvac out of fear threw down their weapons and embraced strangers like brothers. The Shadow Army, the terrible soldiers that had enforced the tyrant's will, simply dissolved into mist and faded away. Vaelith stayed at the temple until sunset. She watched the celebrations begin, the fires being lit, the music starting up from instruments that had been silent for decades. She did not go down to join them. This was not her victory to celebrate. This belonged to all the humans who had taught her what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself. This belonged to Jorik and Mira and Thomas and countless others whose names she carried in her heart. When the stars came out, she finally moved. She walked away from the city, heading toward the forests where her own people waited. They would want to know what had happened. They would want to understand how she had made an impossible shot. She would try to explain, but she knew they would not truly understand. They would see it as skill or luck or destiny. They would not understand that it was simply love. Love for a world that deserved to be free. Love for people who fought even when fighting seemed pointless. Love for the brief, burning lives of humans who had taught an immortal elf the most important lesson of all. The lesson was simple. It did not matter how long you lived. What mattered was what you were willing to die for. And what you were willing to die for showed the truth of what you had lived for. Vaelith disappeared into the night, carrying her human bow and her elven heart, knowing that somewhere in the city behind her, a new chapter was beginning. The tyrant had fallen. The people were free, and all it had taken was one perfect arrow, released by an archer who had learned from the bravest creatures in all the realms. The humans would never know what she had done for them. They would create legends about a mysterious archer who had appeared from nowhere to save them. They would sing songs and tell stories and argue about whether it had really happened or whether it was just a myth. That was fine with Vaelith. She did not need credit or recognition. She only needed to know that she had done what her human friends would have done. She had stood up against darkness. She had taken the shot that everyone said was impossible. And she had won not because she was better than the enemy, but because she believed in something worth fighting for. That was the human way. And it was now her way too.